The Galactic Council made one error, angering humanity. The message came in at 0347 station time, and I was already awake. I had not been sleeping. Sleep had not been easy for the past 2 weeks, not since the Kepler Drift petition had been submitted to the Council's review committee, and silence had returned in its place. Not a denial, not even a procedural delay notice, just silence, the kind that settles around you slowly, like water filling a sealed room, and tells you that something is being decided in a space you are not permitted to enter. I had learned to read that kind of silence over 22 years in the United Human Fleet. It rarely carried good news. So I was in my command chair on the bridge of the UHF warship Unconquered Sun, a mug of coffee cooling on the armrest console, watching the stars through the forward observation port. The Kepler drift was quiet that night. The patrol route was clean. The sensor grids showed nothing worth noting, and my crew of 412 people were spread across the ship in various combinations of rest, routine maintenance, and the quiet background work that keeps a warship functional during long deployments. On the night watch, the bridge ran lean. Lieutenant Callum Oates at navigation, 2 technicians at the secondary sensor boards, and a communications officer monitoring the standard relay traffic. The priority flag appeared on my display, with a color I had seen used exactly 3 times in my career, and never for anything routine. Deep blue, Council Relay Protocol. The authentication string scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Triple-layered encryption, ALUN-certified origin, transmitted through the Grand Conclave's formal communication network from a source on ALUN Prime itself. Blue meant power. Blue meant formality. Blue meant someone very far away had decided we needed to know something and had wrapped that decision in every layer of official weight available to them. I opened the document. I read it once. Then I put the coffee mug down very carefully on the armrest console, using both hands, because my hands needed something deliberate to do. I read it again. The decree was written in unified standard, the formal diplomatic language of the Council, that precise and carefully calibrated mode of communication, refined over 40,000 years of galactic political negotiation, to deliver difficult information, without ever appearing to raise its voice. It was polite, as such documents always are, well-structured. Every sentence performed exactly its intended function, the kind of writing designed, generation by generation, to present devastating news in the cleanest possible form, so that when you later tried to describe how you felt reading it, your emotions seemed excessive, relative to the language that had produced them. What the decree said, stripped of every careful construction, was this. The Galactic Council had completed its review of humanity's petition for expanded resource rights in the Kepler Drift sector. The petition was denied. This appeared in the 3rd paragraph, almost as an afterthought, as though the denial were the smallest piece of the message, which, in terms of consequence, it was. The Council had further determined, following a closed-session review requested by the Vreth hegemony and formally seconded by the Choir of Elun, that 3 human colonial worlds in the Kepler Drift sector, New Carthage, Port Avalon, and the Meridian Station cluster, were to be immediately reclassified as contested zones. The reclassification would trigger a full territorial review process, requiring a minimum of 4 years to complete. During the review period, no Council mutual defense obligations applied to the reclassified worlds. Any incidents occurring within contested zones were classified as internal administrative matters, outside Council jurisdiction, and not subject to any treaty provision that humanity had spent 3 decades negotiating, paying dues to maintain, and counting on. The document closed by noting that humanity had 48 hours to formally acknowledge receipt of the decree, not to respond, not to appeal, to acknowledge receipt. There was no appeal process mentioned because there was no appeal process available. 300 million people on 3 worlds had just been quietly removed from the protection of every agreement we had signed. I read the decree a 3rd time, all the way through, reading for anything I might have missed. A clause that changed the interpretation, a proviso limiting the application, a footnote suggesting the reclassification was temporary in a meaningful sense, something acknowledging that human interests would receive special consideration during the review process. There was nothing like that. The document was exactly what it appeared to be. Lieutenant Oates had stopped humming. He had a habit, I had first noticed it in his 2nd week aboard, 2 years ago, of humming very quietly when the bridge was calm. Something tuneless and rhythmic, barely at the threshold of hearing, the sound a person makes when they are comfortable and not thinking about it. He stopped when the atmosphere in the room shifted, and he had developed over those 2 years a sensitivity to the room's atmosphere that was impressive for someone his age. He was watching me from his navigation station, with the particular alertness of a young officer who knows something has happened and is waiting to understand what. I stood. "Get Commander Harlow and Dr. Oren up here," I said. "Tell them it is not a shipboard emergency, but I need them on the bridge now." He reached for the comm without asking a single question. That was one of the things I valued about him. Commander Lena Harlow arrived 4 minutes later, still straightening her uniform jacket, moving with the economical efficiency of someone who had transitioned from sleep to full function in the time it took to dress. She was my executive officer, 41 years old, from Atlanta, with 15 years of command track experience and a steadiness that made junior officers feel safe and senior officers feel fortunate. She took one look at my face, one quick, reading look, and walked to stand at my side without saying a word. She understood, the way good executives always understand, that the moment to ask questions is not the moment when your commanding officer is standing still and looking at something you have not yet been shown. Dr. Colin Oren arrived 2 minutes after her. He was the ship's chief xenostudies officer, a compact, precise man from Edinburgh who had spent 15 years learning to understand the shape of minds that were not human. He was carrying a mug of tea, because Colin Oren treated tea as a basic operational necessity rather than a comfort item. He was wearing mismatched socks, because he had dressed in the dark and did not consider socks a priority. Despite the hour and the appearance, his eyes were completely clear. Colin was one of those people whose mind ran continuously, whether or not his body was cooperating. I handed him my display tablet with the decree open on it. He read it. His tea cooled untouched in his hand. Lena had been reading over his shoulder. I tracked her in my peripheral vision without looking directly at her, and I saw the moment when the reclassification clause landed, a small movement along her jaw, controlled so quickly that if I had not known her for 3 years I would have missed it entirely. She had family on Port Avalon, a sister, a brother-in-law, 2 children who sent their aunt hand-drawn pictures through the colonial mail system. I had learned this by accident, when an envelope arrived at a briefing that Lena had forgotten to set aside beforehand. I said nothing about it now. She would not have wanted me to. "The closed session review was requested by the Vreth hegemony," Colin said. He was still reading carefully, working through the document. "The Alone seconded it, but the Alone would not have originated this. They have trade dependencies on Kepler drift shipping that they cannot easily replace. Disrupting that shipping hurts them more than any administrative benefit could compensate for. Someone persuaded them," Lena said. Her voice was level. "Someone convinced them that the disruption would be manageable and temporary, and that the benefit to their standing within the council framework outweighed the cost," Colin said. "The Vreth are skilled at that kind of internal council argument. They understand how to make accommodation look like wisdom to species that have something significant to lose." He set the tablet down and picked up his tea, which was cold now. He drank it anyway. "This is not a governance action. It is a positioning action. The Kepler drift's outer belt contains 3 of the richest mineral extraction zones that human survey teams have ever mapped. The colonial territories of New Carthage and Port Avalon sit directly adjacent to 2 of those zones. The reclassification is not a territorial review. It is the removal of an inconvenient presence from space that someone else has decided they want." I had understood this from the first reading of the decree, but hearing Colin say it plainly, stripped of diplomatic language, stated as the transactional reality it was, made it settle differently in the room. It became less like a political abstraction and more like what it actually was. "Send the full text to Earth Command," I told Lena. "Priority 1, authenticated. My cover note attached. No editorial comment from me. The facts, the source, and my request for guidance." "The acknowledgement window?" she said. "Not yet," I said. She understood immediately. Sending the formal acknowledgement meant operating inside the Council's framework for this situation. It meant accepting their timeline, their process, their assumption about how this would proceed. I was not going to signal anything that implied acceptance of a situation I had not chosen, not while I was still waiting to understand what we were going to do about it. She went to the communications station. I turned to Colin. "In your professional judgment," I said, Do the Vreth and the Aelan have any genuine understanding of what they have done here? Not the legal understanding. They know the procedural mechanics clearly. But the actual understanding, the full weight of it. He thought about this carefully, the way he always thought about serious questions, without telling me what he believed I wanted to hear. No, he said, I do not believe they do. The Council's approach to smaller member species, and they genuinely consider humanity smaller in the relevant sense, which is a significant error, is a framework of graduated pressure, administrative constraints, economic restriction, political isolation. You make compliance easier than resistance, and the smaller species calculates its options and concludes that accommodation is preferable to continued conflict. The approach has worked against every species it has been applied to, because every one of those species understood that the Council was the only framework available, and that operating outside it was not a real option. And they believe we will follow the same pattern, I said. They have no evidence to the contrary, he said, with the precision of a man being honest about something that implicated his own professional field. We have been patient. We have been diplomatic. We have functioned within the framework for 30 years without demonstrating, in any concrete way, what we are like when the framework is used against us. Their prediction is based on a consistent pattern. It is simply based on a misunderstanding of what makes the pattern. I thought about my grandmother. She had been born in 2089, 2 years before the collapse began, and she had lived through all 11 years of it, and she had emerged from the other side as a woman who laughed easily, and slept well, and did not spend much time worrying, qualities I had found confusing as a child, and understood more fully as I got older. She used to say, in the matter-of-fact way she said most things, that other species grew up with the stars. We grew up fighting to keep the lights on, not the same education. She had never elaborated, because she felt it did not require elaboration, and she was right. The other species had arrived at the stars from security. They had expanded from stable homeworlds into a galaxy that welcomed them, or at least accommodated them, and they had grown powerful within a framework that recognized and rewarded their growth. The worst thing most of them had faced was territorial competition with neighboring species in the early expansion period, and even that had generally been resolved through council mediation before it became catastrophic. Humanity had arrived at the stars with our dead behind us. 4.2 billion people, in 11 years, from a cascade of failures that had very nearly ended us entirely, ecological collapse, and resource exhaustion, and political disintegration, and a pandemic event that arrived when we were already past our worst point, and we had survived it, not because anyone came to help us, but because the people who were left refused to stop. And what came out the other side of that was not a traumatized species hiding behind its walls, though a traumatized species hiding behind its walls would have been the statistically expected result. What came out was something that had already been inside the worst-case scenario, and had come through with a very specific kind of clarity. We knew how bad could get. We had been there. We had held that knowledge every day since, and it had not broken us. It had made us precise about what we valued, and resolute about what we would and would not accept. The Vreth had read 30 years of patience, and extrapolated forward. They had not understood what had made those 30 years patient rather than fearful. The difference between enduring something because you are afraid of what comes next, and enduring something because you have chosen to give the institution the benefit of the doubt, is invisible from the outside. But it matters enormously when the institution exhausts the doubt you have given it. We were about to find out what happened then. Earth Command responded 6 hours after Lena's transmission. 6 hours was fast. Faster than anything I had seen since the Outer Reach reactor failure 5 years ago, when we lost 4 ships in 40 minutes, and every priority channel in the sector ran hot simultaneously. The fact that 6 hours felt fast to me now told me something about the weight of what we were all carrying. The response did not come from the diplomatic corps. It did not come from the Council Affairs Office, or the Secretary General's communications team. It did not come from any political office that normally managed our relationship with the Grand Conclave. It came from the Secretary of War. Martin Cole was a quiet man. Thin, measured, gray eyes. The economy of expression of someone who had learned early that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the most important one. He had served as an officer for 12 years before entering government, and he had retained the officer's habit of meaning exactly what he said, without addition or decoration. His message was 4 sentences. Admiral Voss, I have reviewed the Council decree. Earth is formulating its response. Stand by for operational orders. I read those 4 sentences 3 times. Not stand by for diplomatic guidance. Not stand by while the legal team reviews our treaty obligations under the mutual defense provisions. Not stand by for a response from the Council Affairs Committee. Stand by for operational orders. I pulled up the sector-wide positioning overlay on my secondary display and began tracking every UHF vessel currently operating in the Kepler Drift. 46 ships, running patrol routes and supply duties across the sector. I studied the map of their positions and began thinking about what a different map might look like and what it would mean. The operational orders arrived 4 hours later. They were addressed simultaneously to every UHF fleet commander in the Kepler Drift sector, which meant the decision had been made above my level before the orders reached me. They were classified at a level I had seen used once before in my entire career. I opened them. I read them. I stood up from my command chair. I walked to the forward observation port. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the stars, letting what I had just read settle fully into place before I tried to carry it or communicate it to anyone else. Lieutenant Oates. Admiral. Wake the senior staff. Briefing room. 20 minutes. A pause. Then wake everyone else. His hand was already moving toward the comm panel. The stars through the forward port were the same stars they had always been. Cold, honest, and completely indifferent to the decisions being made beneath them. They burned the way they had burned for millions of years, and would burn for millions more, without reference to what the Galactic Council had decided, or what the United Human Fleet was about to do about it. I had always found that easier to sit with than most other things. Not because indifference was comforting, exactly, because honesty was, and the stars were always honest. In the briefing room 20 minutes later, I told my senior staff what the operational orders said. Every UHF vessel in the Kepler Drift sector was converging on New Carthage. All 47 ships, including the unconquered sun. We were not going there to hold a ceremony or make a diplomatic gesture. We were going there to establish a position, to be present in a way that was unambiguous and sustained, and to make it clear that the decree on paper and the reality on the ground were not going to be the same thing. Patrick Gale, my tactical officer, was already building the formation plan before I finished speaking. Lena had the look of someone who had been calculating this since the moment she read the decree, and was now receiving confirmation that the calculation had been correct. Colin was quiet, holding the information and thinking about what it meant across the larger picture he spent his professional life studying. Lieutenant Oates was the youngest person in the room, and the weight of it was visible on him in a way it was not on the others, because the others had more years of experience absorbing this kind of weight and managing what it did to them internally. I did not consider that a deficiency. Officers who felt the weight were the ones you wanted making decisions, because they knew what was at stake in a way that no amount of training could fully substitute for. 2 hours to transit, I said. Get ready. They moved. I remained in the briefing room for a moment after the room cleared, looking at the empty table, thinking about the 48-hour acknowledgement window that was ticking without my response, and about what that silence communicated. Not defiance, something older than defiance. The acknowledgement of a simple reality. We were no longer operating inside their framework for this situation, and we had not chosen that. They had. When an institution's mechanism is used to cause harm rather than prevent it, the mechanism loses its claim on the people it has harmed. That is not a theory. That is how things work when you are dealing with a civilization that has already been inside the worst, and come through it, and has a very clear understanding of what it will and will not accept. I stood. I walked out of the briefing room and down the corridor toward the bridge, past the wall of remembrance, the display that cycled through photographs and names from every hard passage humanity had navigated, every cost paid to be standing here today. I did not stop to look at any particular image. I had walked past this wall hundreds of times, and I knew every section of it. But I noticed it, the way you notice something familiar that has suddenly become relevant in a new way. We were adding to it, whether we had chosen to or not. This moment was going into the permanent record, and the people who came after us would walk past it and see our faces and understand what we had been required to do. I wanted to make sure the record would let them understand why. I walked onto the bridge. I sat in my command chair. Lieutenant Oates, I said, signal the fleet. Transit begins in 2 hours. All vessels to be at jump-ready status within 90 minutes. He turned from his station. He was 26 years old, and he was beginning to understand something about this work that no training exercise fully prepared you for. "Aye, Admiral," he said. His voice was steady. I noted that and carried it. We had always had enough steady people. We still did. The transit to New Carthage took 11 hours, and I spent 10 of them on the bridge. Not because the ship required my presence there. Patrick Gale's formation navigation was so precise that 47 ships moved through the fold as a single body, not a collection of individual vessels, and the sensor sweeps ran green for the full duration. There was nothing that demanded my attention in the command chair rather than in my bunk. I stayed on the bridge because the bridge was where I needed to be. Not for the ship. For myself. There are situations where the honest thing is to be visible in your uncertainty, rather than to perform calm behind a closed door, and this was one of them. My crew was experienced, and they would read performed calm for what it was, and what they needed was not a commanding officer pretending everything was settled, but a commanding officer who was manifestly awake and thinking and present. I gave them that by staying in my chair, watching the readout cycle, and letting my mind work without demanding that it produce anything immediately. What I worked through, in those 11 hours, was the question I always return to when a decision with serious consequences is in motion. Not whether the action was justified. I had been over that ground and was satisfied. Not whether it was lawful. The operational orders from Earth Command answered that clearly. The question requiring more thought was the one that sits underneath both justification and legality. The one that asks whether this is right, in the full and honest sense of the word. The Council's decree was legally produced. Every procedural step had been followed. The closed session, the formal request, the seconding, the acknowledgement window. If you judge the decree by the standards the Council used to evaluate its own actions, it was clean. But a clean process producing harmful outcomes is still harmful. That is one of the things large institutions do when they are not functioning as intended. They produce results that serve powerful interests, dress those results in the language of procedure and authority, and the language is genuine, but the result is not. The mechanism that was supposed to protect all member species had been used to strip protection from 300 million people, so that a specific faction could access mineral wealth it had been positioning toward for years. We were going to New Carthage to say this was not acceptable, not as a negotiating position, not as a protest, as a fact about how things actually stood, stated in a language that could not be misunderstood. That was right. And understanding the difference between right and merely justified was what allowed me to sit in my chair for 10 hours with the weight of what was coming, and feel, underneath all of it, a quality I could only describe as clarity. Colin Oren spent most of the transit in the Xeno Studies lab, preparing the briefing on Vreth tactical doctrine that I had requested. He delivered it in 2 parts, a written summary distributed to all senior officers' displays, and a verbal briefing in the main conference room at hour 8 of the transit, which I attended along with Lena, Patrick, Lieutenant Oates, and the department heads. Colin was at his best when he was explaining something he had spent years learning to understand and believed genuinely mattered. He stood at the front of the conference room with the flat display showing Vreth fleet formation patterns, and he spoke for 40 minutes without notes, because he never needed them. Everything he told you he had absorbed completely. The Vreth hegemony had been among the founding species of the modern Galactic Council. Their naval tradition was older than most human civilizations by several thousand years. Their fleet doctrine had developed over centuries of genuine interspecies conflict in the early expansion period, before council mediation became the standard tool for territorial disputes, and it retained that heritage in its emphasis on position, intimidation, and the careful management of escalation. They were expert at making power visible without using it, at arriving in a system in a way that communicated overwhelming force while performing no aggressive act, so that the opposing party felt the full weight of the situation, and arrived at compliance through their own calculation, rather than through direct coercion. This was their preferred operating mode in political disputes, Colin explained. They disliked direct confrontation. They found it inelegant and inefficient. Their institutional memory of interspecies conflict from the early expansion era gave them a genuine respect for what direct confrontation cost, and they had refined the art of winning without fighting to a considerable degree. The formation we are likely to encounter at New Carthage, he said, will be positioned to demonstrate presence rather than to constitute a technical blockade. The distinction matters to them because maintaining the appearance of restraint is part of the strategy. They will be there, clearly and unmistakably, in a way that communicates that the reclassification is already in effect and that the question of who controls this space has been answered. But they will not have their weapons active. They will not have issued any ultimatum to the civilian population. They will be waiting for us to see them and draw the appropriate conclusion. The appropriate conclusion being that we withdraw, Patrick said. The appropriate conclusion being that we recognize the political reality they have established and choose not to contest it in a way that requires them to escalate, Colin said. They are giving us the opportunity to be sensible. In their framework, sensible means understanding that the Council's decision is the decision, and that the best available path forward is to engage with the review process through proper channels over the next 4 years. And in our framework, Lieutenant Oates said, from his position at the end of the table, the question is different. Colin looked at him with the attention he gave to questions that were precise. In your framework, he said carefully, the question is not what is the least damaging form of compliance. It is whether compliance is the right response to an unjust action. Those are different questions, and they produce different answers. They will not understand that distinction, Patrick said. Not immediately. Their entire doctrine is built on the assumption that every rational actor will eventually find the compliance calculation preferable to the resistance calculation. They have evidence for that assumption. It is held for 40,000 years, and across every species the approach has ever been applied to. We are going to be, as far as the historical record shows, the first counterexample they encounter. I said, at what point do they understand the difference between what they expect us to do and what we are doing? When the cost of not understanding becomes undeniable, Colin said. I cannot tell you exactly when that is. I can tell you the realization will not be gradual. It will arrive at a specific moment when something happens that falls outside all their predictive models. Then we need to make sure we are ready for every version of what happens before that moment, I said. After the briefing, I walked the ship for an hour. I did this sometimes during transits, when I needed to think, and the bridge felt too specific for the kind of thinking required. I walked from bow to stern on the port side and back on the starboard, and I let the ambient sounds of the unconquered sun work on me. The vibration of the drives, the soft hums of the environmental systems, the distant murmur of voices from maintenance teams in the secondary corridors. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a ship functioning. I passed the wall of remembrance on my second circuit, and this time I stopped. I stood in front of the section from 2097, at the lowest point of the collapse, when the population curves had been at their steepest descent, and the model projections were at their most dire. There were photographs of the relief camps and reconstruction zones. There were images from the early community assemblies where the surviving population had gathered to decide not what kind of civilization they wanted to build, but whether they were going to build one at all. They had decided to build one. Not because the odds were good, the odds were not good, because the alternative was not something they were willing to choose. That decision was in every ship in this fleet. It was in every crew member and every line of doctrine that governed how we operated. It was what the wall of remembrance actually remembered. Not grief for what was lost, though grief was present too, but the continuity of a specific decision made in the worst circumstances imaginable, still being made, still being held, still being carried forward by the people walking past it now. The Vreth had access to this history. It was in their briefing documents. It was in every standard xenological profile of human civilization. But filed knowledge and carried knowledge are different things, and what the wall held was the kind that could only be carried. We arrived at New Carthage at the end of the 11th hour. Full system scan, Patrick said immediately, calm and precise. All 47 vessels confirmed exit. Formation integrity nominal. I looked at the tactical display. New Carthage was mid-orbit, the planet visible as a blue-green disk, the orbital station showing as a bright point in geosynchronous position. 80 million people, below and unaware of what had arrived in their sky. Between us and the orbital station's approach lane, 12 vessels sat in a loose formation. Vreth configuration. I could identify the design without consulting the registry. The long, narrow primary hulls, the lateral fins swept back at sharp angles, an elegance that was entirely functional, the visual language of a fleet doctrine refined across centuries of real use. They had not deployed weapon systems. They had not opened a hailing channel. They were simply there, in the way a wall is there. Not doing anything specific, and just impossible to ignore. It was exactly what Colin had described. Presence as argument, occupation as statement. Open hailing frequencies, I said. Standard military protocol. Open, said Lieutenant Francis Webb, my chief communications officer, from her station. Vreth formation. This is Admiral Mara Voss, commanding officer of the UHF warship Unconquered Sun, and fleet command of the United Human Fleet Kepler Drift contingent. You are positioned in the primary approach lane of New Carthage Orbital Station, which is a human colonial installation on a human colonial world. I am giving you 30 minutes to clear the approach lane and withdraw your vessels from the New Carthage system. 30 minutes, starting now. I closed the channel. While I had been speaking, Patrick had been running the fleet deployment without being asked. All 47 ships were spreading into combat formation, covering the full geometry of the system, with no approach vector unaccounted for. Weapon arrays were active. Shield arrays were at maximum efficiency. Targeting systems were live across the entire fleet, and any competent sensor operator reading this picture from inside the Vreth formation would see exactly what was in front of them. We were not posturing. We were present, and we were ready for everything. I did not go to the observation port. I stayed in my command chair and watched the tactical display, and I waited. The 30 minutes was not an opening position in a negotiation. I was not going to extend it, modify it, or offer alternatives. I had stated a clear action and a clear timeline, and I was going to hold both, because clarity was what the situation required, and consistency was what would demonstrate we were serious. At 7 minutes, the Vreth Patrol Formation's commanding officer opened a channel. His name was Veth Saran. I had identified him from the fleet registry while the formation was being assessed. His voice came through the translator with the characteristic layered resonance of Vreth speech, calm and authoritative, carrying the confidence of a commander who had conducted this exact kind of operation before and understood how it was supposed to proceed. He said that under Council Resolution 7741 Delta, the New Carthage system had been formally reclassified as a contested zone. He said the UHF fleet was operating without appropriate authorization. He said this was a serious matter, and that UHF vessels were required to withdraw. He gave us 6 hours. 6 hours. He had taken my 30 minutes and replaced them with 6 hours. He had not understood the 30 minutes at all, had read it as an opening position in a negotiation, rather than a statement of existing reality. I let 11 minutes pass after his transmission ended. 11 minutes of complete silence from the Unconquered Sun and every ship in our fleet. 47 ships holding position, holding weapons locks, holding formation, saying nothing. I wanted Veth Saran to sit inside those 11 minutes and feel them, because silence has content, and the content of this silence was, we heard you, and we are not scrambling, we are not uncertain, we already know what we are going to do. Then I opened the channel again. Commander Veth Saran, the 30-minute window I offered has not expired. When it does, if your vessels have not cleared the approach lane, I will treat their continued presence as a hostile act and respond accordingly. I am not renegotiating the timeline. I am not extending the offer. 30 minutes from my original transmission. I closed the channel. 19 more minutes. Nothing moved in the system except the background tracking of sensor arrays and the steady orbital progress of New Carthage below us. The tactical display showed 12 Vreth vessels in the approach lane and 47 human ships holding combat position across the system, and nothing in that picture changed, and the silence was complete. I watched the display. I said nothing. My crew said nothing. The Unconquered Sun ran its quiet background functions. The stars moved by imperceptible increments in the observation port. At 29 minutes and 47 seconds, the first Vreth vessel began to move. A light escort, the smallest of the 12. It moved slowly at first and then with more commitment, pulling out of formation and clearing the approach lane. Within 40 seconds, a second vessel followed. Then a third. Within 2 minutes, the entire formation was in motion, withdrawing in a pattern that was not quite orderly, the movement of something that had reached a decision quickly and was now executing it with more speed than elegance. They cleared the approach lane. They did not stop at 200,000 kilometers as I had specified. They continued toward the outer system edge, which told me they had decided to put a significant amount of space between themselves and 47 human warships whose commanding officer had just demonstrated, with precision and without heat, that she meant exactly what she said. "Approach lane is clear," Patrick said quietly. "Maintain combat formation. No pursuit. Weapons on standby, not stand down. Hold position in the system. I, Francis. Tell New Carthage Orbital that the approach lane is open and to resume normal operations. Tell them the United Human Fleet is here and that we are staying." I sat back in my command chair. 80 million people below, most of them going about the ordinary business of their ordinary day, some aware from their station sensor feeds that something had been happening in the space above their planet, some with family on the other two reclassified worlds, waiting for any information at all. They knew, now, that someone had shown up. That was not everything. It was not the last thing or the resolving thing, but it was the first thing, and the first thing was done. "Lieutenant Oates," I said. He looked up from navigation. "Earlier, you asked how you do command," I said. "Yes. This is part of it. You say what you mean. You do what you say. You trust the people around you to do the same. You cannot control what the other person does. You can only control whether you are ready for every version of it." He held that. "Were you sure they would leave?" he asked. "No, I was sure we were ready, if they did not." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something away for later use, rather than merely acknowledging a statement. He would be in a chair like mine someday, and this was the kind of thing that mattered in a chair like mine, and he knew it. I composed a brief transmission to Earth Command. "New Carthage is secure." I watched the tactical display. 12 orange markers moving toward the outer system edge. 47 blue markers holding position like a wall around New Carthage. The stars through the observation port, burning the way they always had. 3 hours later, Colin came to the bridge. He had been in the science lab tracking the Vreth formation's communication signals, and he had the look of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed in a way that was both expected and significant. They transmitted a full situation report to Vreth Command within 3 minutes of beginning their withdrawal, he said. "I cannot decrypt the content, but the transmission length and timing tell me it was a detailed account rather than a status update. They spent 3 minutes composing something that required explanation. They did not expect to leave," I said. "No. Their working model was that our arrival with 47 ships meant we wanted better terms within the Council framework, that we were using military presence as leverage for a more favorable settlement, while still operating inside the negotiation structure they controlled. They are going to go back to their command and report that we behaved in a way that did not fit any of their models. And their command will spend time trying to understand what we are doing. Yes, and they will arrive at the wrong answer, initially. The wrong answer is that this is an extreme negotiating position that will eventually moderate. The right answer is that we are not negotiating the terms. We are contesting the premise. They will not understand that distinction until the cost of not understanding it becomes undeniable. Then we need to make sure the cost arrives before they can adapt their approach," I said. Colin was quiet for a moment. "The border installations," he said. "Yes. The operational orders had been updated while we were in transit. I had read them on arrival, and had been thinking about them while Veth Saran's formation withdrew. 3 Vreth border installations along the primary transit corridor between human colonial space and Vreth territory, the points from which Vreth patrol vessels had been conducting what Earth Command's documentation described as unauthorized interdiction of human commercial shipping, stopping cargo vessels, delaying them, impounding goods under claimed violations of regulations that no one had agreed to. Human shipping companies had been filing complaints for 3 months. The Council's review committee had been processing those complaints. Processing, not resolving. Earth Command had decided to resolve the matter differently. We were to secure the installations, board them, preserve their records in full, document everything. "We are splitting the fleet," I told Lena, who had come to the bridge while Colin and I were talking. 30 ships remain here under your command. 17. Come with me. She looked at the 30-ship allocation and ran the tactical numbers. She arrived at the same assessment I had. 30 was sufficient for holding New Carthage against any Vreth response that could reach us before the installation operations were complete. "Port Avalon," she said, as she had said it before, "is protected by the fleet you are holding," I said, and it is going to be protected by what we find in those installations, and what we do with what we find." She understood. She was already pulling up the formation designs for the 30 ships she was keeping. "When do you leave?" she said. "As soon as the formation split is complete," I said. She nodded. She went to work. I looked at the tactical display one more time, at New Carthage, and the 50 million kilometers of monitored space around it, and at the stars beyond that in the direction we were going. And I thought about the next phase, and what it needed to produce, and about the specific kind of precision that this kind of operation required. Not violence. Evidence. The most durable kind of argument in any political dispute is not force. Force can always be met with force, and the argument never ends. The most durable argument is a record, an authenticated, specific, documented record of what actually happened, in the words and files of the people who made it happen, entered into every relevant archive where it could not be removed. We were going to build that record. And then, we were going to show it to everyone watching. The intelligence briefing on the border installations took 3 hours to assemble properly, and Colin ran it himself, because the information was layered enough that the interpretation mattered as much as the raw data. 3 installations. They sat at roughly equal intervals along the primary transit corridor connecting human colonial space in the Kepler drift to the main galactic shipping lanes, positioned at points that any competent spatial planner would have identified as natural choke points, places where the geometry of the routes concentrated traffic, where a small number of monitoring positions could observe and control a large volume of movement. The installations had been constructed 18 months ago. That timing was important. 18 months ago was precisely when the Vreth Hegemony's Territorial Planning Office had moved from general interest in the Kepler drift's outer belt to active operational planning, based on the pattern analysis Colin's team had assembled from commercial data intercepts, and the careful cross-referencing that good xenostudies work produces, when done without assuming any conclusion in advance. The installations had not been built to monitor neutral space. They had been built to monitor human space. Specifically, the 3 transit routes that carried the bulk of the commerce, keeping New Carthage, Port Avalon, and Meridian Station economically viable. They had spent 18 months being used for exactly that purpose. "The interdiction program," Colin said, standing at the front of the briefing room with the flat display showing a map of the transit corridor with the 3 installations marked, was not random enforcement of transit regulations. The timing and targeting of the delays and cargo impoundments was calculated. Specific shipments were selected based on their manifests and their destination facilities. The pattern, when mapped against the infrastructure development cycles of each of the 3 colony worlds, shows a consistent bias toward disrupting the inputs most critical to each world's current development phase. He pulled up a series of graphs. They were the kind that did not require explanation once you understood what you were looking at, which was by design. Colin had a gift for presenting data so that its implications were visible, rather than requiring the audience to supply the interpretive work. New Carthage was in the middle of a major expansion of its water extraction infrastructure when the delays began, he said. Port Avalon was completing the 2nd phase of its central power grid. Meridian Station was upgrading its medical facility to full trauma center capacity, which required regular shipments of specialized equipment from 3 different manufacturing partners. In each case, the delays targeted the specific shipments that would cause maximum disruption to the development phase then in progress. Not randomly, not incidentally, deliberately. Patrick said from across the table, someone was receiving information about the colonial development schedules. Someone in the Vreth installation command structure had access to information about the colonial development plans, Colin confirmed. That information is not publicly available. It would have required either an intelligence source within the colonial administrations or access to council planning databases that record colonial development submissions, both of which are worth noting. The more important point for our current purposes is that the operation was sophisticated, sustained, and coordinated with the reclassification process. The decree was not a sudden decision. It was the final step of a process that had been running for over a year and a half. Lena said, quietly, "They spent a year and a half setting this up." "They were thorough," Colin said, without inflection. He was a scientist, and he described what he found without adding emotional weight to it, because he believed the facts were sufficient, and that adding emotion was a form of distortion. In this case, the facts were more than sufficient. What do we expect to find when we board the installations? I asked. Communication logs, operational records, targeting criteria, he said, and most importantly, coordination records between the installation commanders and the VRETH Territorial Planning Office. The pattern analysis shows the installations were not acting independently. They were receiving direction. If we can retrieve and authenticate those communication records, we will have a documented chain connecting the interdiction operation to the planning apparatus that designed the reclassification process. That changes the political picture, I said. It changes the picture for every species watching this situation, he said. Right now, this is a political dispute. Council authority against human colonial interests. Familiar, manageable, the kind of conflict that has a standard resolution arc. If we can document a coordinated multi-year operation using council administrative processes as cover for economic predation, the picture becomes something different. It becomes evidence of institutional abuse, and that is a different kind of problem for the VRETH within their own political environment. I understood what he was telling me. This was not just about holding New Carthage. It was about building a record, an authenticated, specific, documented account of what had actually been done, in the files and communications of the people who had done it, entered into every relevant archive where it could be examined and could not be removed. The boarding protocol needs to be immaculate, I said. Every step documented, every action justified, every piece of evidence handled in a way that cannot be challenged on procedural grounds. No ambiguity in how we obtained any of it. Understood, Patrick said. He was already composing the security team deployment in his head. The installation personnel, they are officers and administrators following orders within a chain of command they did not design. They did not create the program they implemented. But we treat them with complete professionalism. Personal quarters are not searched. Personal communications are not reviewed. We are there for the institutional records. Lena said. That will matter for the record. It will matter for more than the record, I said. It is the right way to do this. We split the fleet in the briefing room, over a system map with colored markers. 30 ships would remain at New Carthage under Lena's command, maintaining the position we had established, and keeping the approach lane and the system clear. The remaining 17 would depart with me for the installations. Lena studied the 30-ship allocation and ran her numbers. She arrived at the same assessment I had. 30 was sufficient to hold against any VRETH response that could reach the system before the installation operations were complete. Port Avalon, she said, for the third time, and this time it was a statement rather than a question, the acknowledgement of something she had decided rather than something she needed resolved. Is protected by the fleet you are holding, I said, and by what we are going to find in those installations. She straightened. She became Commander Harlow, and she stayed that way, which was what I needed her to be, and what she had chosen to be. I will have the formation assignments ready in 90 minutes, she said. I sent a transmission to Owen Barrett at our diplomatic mission on Alun Prime, telling him what we were about to do, and asking him to monitor the moderate block's informal communication channels carefully. I wanted to know the moment anyone reached out through unofficial channels, because that would be the signal that the political calculation inside the council was shifting, and that the time for a different kind of conversation was approaching. The 17-ship formation departed for the first installation at standard transit speed, because there was no emergency timeline driving this leg, and no reason to stress the hardware unnecessarily. 16 hours. I used most of it reviewing the boarding protocols with Patrick and the security team leads, going through every contingency until I was confident that every person stepping onto an installation knew exactly what they were there to do, and how, and what they were not there to do. The first installation was a modest structure by the standards of any established space facility, a monitoring station rather than a military outpost, running on skeleton crew. When our formation held position 200 kilometers off its main structure, and I opened the hailing channel, the installation commander, a VRETH officer named Vel Korath, took 17 minutes to respond. His voice carried the strain of a person who had received a standing order from very far away, and was now being told that the order would not protect him from what was happening. He said this was a violation of council authority, and that he was required to report it through official channels. You are welcome to report it, I said. We are placing this facility under temporary UHF administrative authority, not confiscating your communication equipment. Your official reports can be made through the process my team will establish when we come aboard. Your cooperation will be noted in the record." He complied. The boarding team moved through the installation with the precision I had specified. The crew was gathered in the common area and given a full explanation of what was happening and why. Not a summary, a complete account, in language that did not condescend. Their personal areas were not touched. Their private communication devices were sealed and remained in their possession, subject to inspection only if specific documented reason arose. The operational systems were accessed through standard interfaces with every action logged in real time. The data extraction specialists began on the communication records the moment they had access. It took 11 hours at the first installation to complete the data extraction to our standards. By the time we moved to the second, Colin's team had begun analysis and was sending me summaries that confirmed, in increasing detail, everything the pattern analysis had suggested. The coordination records were there, communication chains between the installation command and the Vreth Territorial Planning Office. Internal targeting criteria documented in the installation's own operational files, the specific criteria by which shipments were selected for delay or impoundment, cross-referenced against colonial development schedules with a specificity that told me the people who designed this program had been entirely confident it would never be reviewed by the people it had been designed to harm. That confidence had been reasonable, given everything they knew about how the Council's administrative processes worked. It had also been wrong. The second and third installations yielded their records without significant incident. The Vreth hegemony had apparently transmitted some kind of instruction to the remaining installation commanders after Velkorath reported what was happening, because the commanders at installations 2 and 3 were both more prepared for our arrival, and more visibly distressed by it. Prepared in the sense that they had been told we were coming. Distressed in the sense that nothing they had been told gave them a practical way to prevent what was happening. Neither attempted any meaningful resistance. Both complied, under varying degrees of evident stress. On the fourth day after departing New Carthage, I had the complete authenticated record transmitted to 4 recipients. Owen Barrett, at the mission on Aelin Prime, the Council's General Diplomatic Registry, the Karathi Ambassador's official diplomatic address, and the personal diplomatic address of the Umanath representative. The Karathi had been the most openly supportive of the non-aligned species from the beginning. The Umanath representative had made a series of quiet, carefully phrased public statements that, read with the attention they deserved, had consistently pointed in the direction we needed the moderate bloc to move. I did not send the record to the Vreth ambassador. He would receive it through the council registry. He would know what was in it before he received it, because Velkorath would have reported as much as he knew. But receiving it formally, through the council's own archival system, with full authentication and the stamps of our diplomatic mission on the cover document, was different from receiving a report. It was a record that now existed independently of anyone's ability to characterize it. Barrett's response came back within 2 hours of the transmission. He had read the material quickly, and his assessment was brief and precise. This changes the landscape considerably. He was already tracking 7 separate informal back-channel conversations that had begun within hours of the second installation boarding being reported to the Council, and the conversations were happening between species that had previously maintained careful public neutrality. When someone reaches out through informal channels, I wrote back, receive them warmly and be prepared to engage seriously. Make sure you know exactly what we require before that conversation happens, because the moment they reach out is the moment when what we require is what they are ready to hear. The informal contact arrived 36 hours after the evidence transmission. It came through the mission as I had expected, not through a formal council channel, which would have committed the Aelin to a public position they were not yet ready to hold, but through a quiet routing that gave everyone the option to treat the conversation as exploratory, rather than binding. The Aelin wanted to have an unofficial conversation about the path toward resolution. Owen Barrett received the request and asked my preference. I said, invite their envoy to the unconquered sun. Her name was Mirren. She arrived in a small diplomatic courier, docked at our secondary bay with the efficiency of someone who had done sensitive navigation many times before. She brought 2 aides who were clearly intelligence-trained rather than administrative staff. This was not a casual diplomatic visit. Someone very senior in the choir of Aelun had decided this conversation needed to happen, and had sent the person they trusted most to conduct it. I met her in the main conference room with Colin and Patrick. I sat across from her at the table and let her begin, because the person who had called the meeting should set its direction. She opened with a formal greeting in Standard and then, without any preliminary hedging, said she had been asked to understand what humanity required to resolve the current situation. I had prepared for this question, not the diplomatic version of preparation, where you consider every angle and build a position with room to give ground. The honest version, where you know what you actually need, have thought through why you need it, and are prepared to say it clearly. I gave her the 4 requirements: recognition of all 3 colony worlds as permanent sovereign human territory, removal of Resolution 7741 Delta from the Council's active record, a formal apology entered into the permanent record of the Grand Conclave, a human seat on the Security Directorate with full voting rights. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was very still. The formal apology, she said, that will generate the most resistance from the hegemony. I understand that, I said. It remains a requirement. She asked me to explain why, not to challenge the requirement, to understand it. The distinction was real, and I responded to it as such, because what happened was not a policy dispute resolved through imperfect process, I said. It was deliberate. It was planned over more than a year and a half, using the Council's own administrative mechanisms as cover for an operation that caused real harm to real people. An apology entered into the permanent record does not exist as a symbolic gesture. It exists as a factual acknowledgement, a statement of what actually occurred, in a document that cannot be altered, and that will be readable by any species that wants to understand this period. Without that acknowledgement, the record shows only a conflict that was resolved by negotiation. That is not an accurate account of what happened. She sat with this for a moment. Requiring a formal apology from the Vreth hegemony has no precedent in the Council's history, she said. There are first times for most things, I said. The Council's record also does not include a member species suspending its participation and holding its defense fund contributions in escrow. We have been doing new things this week. Something shifted in her expression. Not amusement exactly, but the recognition of something accurate and unexpected in what I had said. I filed that. The Security Directorate seat, she said. That requires a council vote. I know. The vote will pass, or it will not. If it passes, it passes. If it does not pass cleanly, we will understand which species are willing to continue operating the way the Vreth have operated, and we will plan accordingly. I expect it will pass. The Council has just been shown what happens when decisions about human colonial space are made without human participation in the room. The lesson is not subtle. She thought about this carefully. She had good judgment. I could feel it in the quality of her attention, in the questions she chose to ask, and the ones she chose to hold back for later. You are very calm, she said. I am resolved, I said. They are different qualities. We spent another hour on the practical mechanics of what a resolution path might look like, which council species were most likely to support the directorate seat proposal, how the formal apology process would need to be structured to survive Vreth procedural challenges, what the realistic timeline was for a council vote, given the current political dynamics. She was thorough and precise, and I found myself respecting her intelligence more the longer she talked. She was giving me more than she was probably authorized to give, and I noted this without pressing it, because she was giving it because she believed it was right. At the door of the conference room, as she prepared to leave, she paused. Admiral, may I ask a personal question? Go ahead. When you gave Commander Veth Saran the 30 minutes at New Carthage, were you afraid? I thought about how to answer honestly. I was prepared, I said, for every version of what might happen, including the versions that would have been much harder than what actually occurred. Whether that is the same as not being afraid, I am not certain. I have been doing this for 22 years. I am not sure fear operates for me the way it used to. She held that. I think I am beginning to understand the thing I did not understand before, she said. I understood that your species was resilient. I did not understand that your resilience has a direction. It moves. Other species under this kind of pressure are looking for the least damaging version of compliance. You were not looking for that at all. No, I said, we were not. She left. I turned to Colin, who had been sitting quietly against the wall for the entire meeting. She will deliver what she said she could deliver, he said, before I asked. And she is moving faster than her formal authorization probably allows. Because she has concluded that speed matters more than procedure right now. The choir wants out of this situation cleanly, and she is the person they have trusted to make that happen. Good, I said. Then Patrick's comm chimed. He looked at it. His face did the specific thing it did when something had changed, and the change was significant. Admiral, he said, we have a problem. He showed me the tactical feed from the Meridian system. 22 Vreth vessels, heavy class. 60,000 civilians. A 6-hour deadline. I was out of my chair before he finished reading the transmission. The tactical display for the Meridian system loaded in under 5 seconds, and I stood in front of it and read everything it showed and understood, in those same 5 seconds, exactly what the Vreth had decided to do. 22 vessels, heavy class, in Vreth fleet terminology, primary combat designation, not patrol craft or escort class, but ships designed for sustained engagement. They were positioned in a containing formation around the Meridian Station cluster, covering every exit vector from the station's operational space. They had not technically blockaded the system. The communication relays were still running. Docking traffic had not been physically stopped, but the formation was a containing formation in every meaningful sense, and any sensor operator reading it, on the station or on a ship 100 light-years away, could read the meaning without help. Meridian Station was a logistics hub, not a military installation, not a colonial administration center, but the supply backbone that served the Kepler Drift's colonial network, the traffic management and warehousing facility that kept the region's supply chains connected. It ran on a civilian workforce of approximately 60,000 people, long-term residents, people who had built their lives there, whose children attended the station's schools, whose parents were in the medical facilities, whose neighbors borrowed tools from them and invited them to dinners on the station's common deck. 60,000 people who had signed up to run supply chains and had not signed up for anything else. The Vreth Fleet Commander's transmission to Meridian Station was logged, and in the packet that reached my display alongside the tactical data. I read it twice. He had said, in formally structured standard, that Meridian Station was a contested zone facility under Council Resolution 7741 Delta, and that the station's administrative authority was required to formally signal its intent to submit to Council administrative oversight within 6 hours. He noted that the Vreth fleet would maintain its current position pending the station's response. Maintain its current position. 6 hours. It was not a technical threat in the sense of explicitly stating what would occur if the deadline passed without compliance. It did not need to be. 22 heavy-class vessels containing 60,000 civilian lives in a forming perimeter said everything that needed to be said without any explicit statement. The arithmetic was self-explanatory. This was not a response to our installation operations exactly, though the timing made the relationship clear. This was the Vreth looking for the limit. They had been pushed back at New Carthage. They had lost administrative control of their border installations. They had watched the moderate bloc begin to move as the evidence record spread through the Council's diplomatic networks. They were looking for the point at which humanity's resolve ran up against something it would not cross, and they had calculated that 60,000 civilian lives were that point. The calculation was understandable in institutional terms. It was the calculation any Council framework player would make. What it got wrong was the assumption about our response. Patrick, I said, fastest transit to Meridian from our current position. He was already at the navigation station. He had started the calculation the moment the feed came in. Standard FTL parameters, Admiral. 12 hours. 12 hours. The Vreth window expired in 6. Not fast enough, I said. No. A deliberate pause. The kind that means the next thing said is the thing that matters. Dr. Patel's work. I looked at him. 6 months ago, I had authorized a theoretical study for the engineering team. Kiran Patel, the Unconquered Sun's chief engineering officer, was one of those engineers whose intelligence operated in the space between rigorous technical mastery and genuine creative thinking, the kind of person who reads the limits stated in a manual and then asks, with genuine curiosity rather than recklessness, what happens if you approach those limits from a different angle? The study had been authorized as exploratory work, the kind of thing that keeps engineering teams sharp during long deployments. I had signed the authorization without expecting it to become operationally relevant. It had become operationally relevant. Get her on the line, I said. Kiran Patel's voice came through the bridge comm, with the quality of a person who has been awake for a long time, thinking continuously about a specific problem, and has been waiting for a specific conversation. She did not sound groggy. She sounded sharp in the way that people get sharp when something they have been preparing for has finally arrived and is concrete rather than theoretical. She gave me the numbers directly, without preamble, because that was how she communicated, and because she understood that what I needed was not reassurance but data. The modified drive output her team had modeled would reduce transit time by between 30 and 40%. At the lower end of that range, we arrived at Meridian approximately 7 hours and 20 minutes after departure. At the upper end, closer to 7 hours flat. Both figures put us past the Vreth commander's original 6-hour deadline. The deadline will be extended, I said. That is my assessment as well, she said. Based on what Dr. Oren's briefings have established about Vreth institutional decision-making, a deadline in this kind of political pressure operation is a tool for producing compliance, not a genuine intent marker for immediate action at the stated time. They need submission from the station, not a confrontation they cannot manage with 22 ships, while we hold the Kepler drift with 47. And the drive modifications, risk to the crew. Low, she said, immediately, and without any of the hedging that would have told me she was softening the answer. I want to be clear about the hardware risk, because it is real. A full dry dock inspection will be required after the operation, and we will likely sustain structural microfractures in the hull plating, particularly along the primary load-bearing sections of the ventral frame. The drives themselves will need significant maintenance before they can be certified for standard service again, but the physical risk to the crew from the transit itself is minimal. I would not recommend this if it were not. You know that. I did know that. Kiran Patel was not a person who told you something was safe when it was not, because she understood that if she were wrong about that kind of thing, the cost was paid by people, not by abstractions. How long to implement the modifications across all 17 ships? I have already been in contact with the engineering leads on 3 of the 17, since the Meridian data came in, she said. They were waiting for this call. The remaining 14 will need briefing and coordination time. 90 minutes for all 17, if I run the implementation coordination myself. Do it, I said. 90 minutes. I want us at transit ready, with modifications implemented. Admiral. I opened the fleet channel and gave the Meridian transit orders to the 17 ships in the formation. Then I opened the secure channel to Lena at New Carthage. I have the Meridian feed, she said, before I spoke. Her voice was completely steady. She had been watching it on the same relay I had. Hold your 30 ships at New Carthage, I said. Do not move the covering formation. Understood. A pause that lasted a few seconds past the operational beat. Mara, she said. She used my given name. She had not done that since before we left Earth Command's patrol zone 3 weeks ago. I know, I said. You are going to get there. I am going to get there, I said. She closed the channel. I sat in my command chair for the 90 minutes, while Patel's team coordinated the modifications across all 17 ships. I did not pace. I did not review the tactical feed for the 15th time. I sat, and I thought about what needed to be true when we arrived, and I made sure in my mind that I was ready for every version of what we might find. Francis Webb was monitoring the Meridian communication channels. Station is transmitting normally, she reported at 20-minute intervals. No distress signals. No submission signal. Station administration has not responded to the Vreth commander's deadline. Keep tracking. 91 minutes after I gave Patel the order, she reported all 17 ships modified and ready. She also said, and this is the part I will carry as long as I carry anything, that 2 members of her engineering team, Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe, both junior engineers who had been working on the drive modification project for the past 6 months, had asked to be stationed in the drive control room for the duration of the transit, to monitor the stress readings manually and make real-time adjustments that the automated systems were not designed to handle at these output levels. They volunteered, I said. Yes, Patel said. I explained what the transit required. They asked to do it. I held that for a moment. Approve the request, I said. Put their names in the mission log and in my personal report. We entered FTL at an output level that no technical manual I had ever read would have certified as safe. The drives ran differently than they ran at standard output, louder, with a vibration that ran through the ship's frame and up through the floor and the chair and the air itself, present in a way that was not alarming, but was honest. The machinery making this possible was being asked to do something beyond its rated parameters. It was telling you that plainly. In the drive control room, Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe stood at their monitoring posts and made their adjustments. I know their names. I knew them before I knew their ranks, and I carried them through every one of the 7 hours and 22 minutes of that transit, the way you carry names when you understand that they represent people, not data points. People who had been given a clear choice, and had chosen yes, and who were now standing in a room full of stress readings because of that choice. We came out of FTL into the Meridian system 51 minutes past the Vreth commander's original 6-hour deadline. He had extended it, as Patel and I had predicted. The Vreth fleet was still in position around the station. The containing formation was unchanged. The station beacon was transmitting normally, which meant the civilian population was intact. 60,000 people, still there. All 22 Vreth heavy-class vessels sat in their formation, and behind that formation, the station ran its ordinary lights and its ordinary signals, and 60,000 ordinary lives were inside it. I opened every available frequency simultaneously. Military bands, civilian bands, commercial relay, the diplomatic channel, the emergency broadcast spectrum. Everything with a receiver in this system was going to hear what I said. This is Admiral Mara Voss, United Human Fleet. I am addressing the commanding officer of the Vreth fleet, currently holding position around Meridian Station. You have 60,000 civilians behind you. You have 17 UHF warships in front of you. You have 30 seconds to stand down and begin withdrawing from this system. I did not describe what came after 30 seconds. I did not need to. The 17 ships behind my voice were the description of everything I had not said, and any sensor operator in this system reading the formation, the active weapon locks, the shield arrays at maximum, the full combat readiness of a fleet that had just pushed its drives past their rated limits to get here in time. All of it said what words would have only weakened. I watched the tactical display. 12 seconds. The first Vreth vessel began to move. Not a slow pivot, not a gradual turn. A committed motion, a pivot followed immediately by thrust, the motion of something that has made a decision completely and is executing it without hesitation. At 20 seconds, 4 more vessels were under thrust. At 27 seconds, all 22 were moving. They cleared the station perimeter. They cleared the operational zone. They continued clearing, pulling back toward the outer system edge, the formation staying coherent, but moving with a speed that came from something beyond training. Station perimeter is clear, Patrick said quietly. Maintain full combat formation, I said. No pursuit. Aye, Francis said. Meridian Station is hailing us. Tell them we are here. Tell them their operational space is clear, and they can open their docking bays. Tell them the fleet is holding position in the system. I sat back. The weight of everything that had brought us to this moment settled into me at once. The 11 hours of first transit to New Carthage, the installation operations, the 31 hours since I had last been off duty, the 7 hours and 22 minutes of the driven past limits transit, the drive control room, Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe standing at their posts. All of it was real. All of it had been necessary. None of that made any of it lighter. I went off duty for the first time in 31 hours. I did not go to my quarters. My quarters had 4 walls, and what I needed right now was something wider. So I went to the observation lounge, and I sat in the chair nearest the viewport, and I looked at the stars over Meridian. I did not manage what I was feeling. I did not organize it into something more useful or more professional. I let it settle the way things settle when you stop trying to control the process. Not away, but into you. The way rain settles into ground, becoming part of what the ground is, rather than a separate thing on top of it. I thought about Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe, about what it means to volunteer for the hardest post in a difficult situation, when the situation has been explained to you clearly, and you understand exactly what you are volunteering for. About how that kind of choice is not heroism in the abstract sense, not the dramatic kind that people describe with large words, but something much more specific, a calculation that other people's lives are worth the cost to yourself, made without drama, without fanfare, in the drive control room of a ship being asked to do something it had not been designed to do. I thought about 60,000 people on Meridian Station opening their docking bays in the morning, about what they would not fully know, that 2 junior engineers had stood for 7.5 hours in a room of stress readings to make it possible for the fleet to arrive when it arrived. Most of those 60,000 people would never know those names. They would know that the fleet had come. They would not know what the fleet had asked of specific people to get there. That was fine. That was how it should be. The work that protects ordinary lives should allow those lives to remain ordinary. The 60,000 residents of Meridian Station did not need to carry the weight of everything that had been done so that their morning could be ordinary. But I was going to carry it. That was part of what this work meant. Someone brought coffee to the observation lounge. A junior crew member, young, who set the mug on the side table and said nothing and left without being asked. I said thank you to the closing door and meant it fully, which is one of the things I have noticed about exhaustion. It strips away the performative elements of gratitude and leaves only the real thing. I held the mug. I felt the warmth of it. I looked at the stars. We had not won cleanly. I had known we would not, and I had known it would matter that we had not. The victories that count are the ones that cost something real, and the cost is always paid by specific people, not by the words we use to describe what happened afterward. Specific people deserve to be known individually, not averaged into an outcome. Claire Ashworth, Daniel Lowe. I would carry their names the way I carried every name on the wall of remembrance, not as a list of the past, but as weight in the present, and not weight as burden, but weight as the thing that keeps you honest about what is real. After a while, I finished the coffee. I sat longer. Then I stood up and went back to the bridge. The work was not finished. Not even close to finished. The Meridian situation had been resolved for now, but the larger situation had not been resolved, and what had just happened at Meridian was going to accelerate the timeline of everything that came next. The Vreth had looked for the limit. They had found something else instead. Now they were going to have to decide what to do with that information. And so were we. The Galactic Council convened its second emergency session 8 days after Meridian Station was secured, and I read the full transcript in my quarters, while the unconquered sun held position in the outer Meridian system, maintaining a presence that made it plain we were not leaving. The second session was different from the first in ways the formal transcript tried to obscure but could not fully conceal. The first had been driven by Vreth outrage, and the expectation that outrage would produce results. The second was driven by something that 40,000 years of Council institutional history had not provided a clear protocol for, a situation that was not resolving according to any established model, and a growing number of member species that were trying to understand what that meant for them individually. 13 species had formally raised concerns after the first session. After the second, 21 had done so. The increase was significant, not because 21 was a majority, it was not, but because it marked the threshold at which a position shifts from dissent to emerging consensus. Individual voices begin to sound less like objections and more like the early crystallization of something larger. 21 species registering the same concerns in the formal record was the Council's internal political atmosphere sending a signal. Owen Barrett's analysis of the session was more useful than the transcript itself. He had been present for the full session, and had spent 20 years learning to read the Council's political body language, which ambassador sat near which other, what the informal conversations during breaks indicated, what specific word choices in formal statements meant when you understood the institutional context of the speaker. His analysis took 40 minutes to read and was worth every minute. The Vreth ambassador Vel Sarath had arrived at the session with what Barrett described as aggressive confidence, and Barrett was precise enough in his descriptions that the distinction he was drawing mattered. Confident authority is the manner of someone who believes the situation is proceeding as expected. Aggressive confidence is the manner of someone who knows it has not, and is using forcefulness to compensate for the uncertainty that implies. The distinction was not always visible in the formal transcript, which recorded words rather than manner, but Barrett had been in the room. Vel Sarath had demanded coordinated enforcement action against humanity. He had used the phrase, unprecedented breach of galactic order, repeatedly. He had submitted a formal motion calling for collective measures across all Council member species. The motion had received 3 votes in its favor. 3 votes, in a body of 43 member species. 3 votes was not a narrow defeat. 3 votes was the Council's political architecture saying, in the clearest language it had available, that the motion had no real support beyond the parties that had proposed it. The Alun delegation had voted against the enforcement motion, quietly, without announcement, by simply registering their vote in the negative and offering no explanation for the record. Barrett read this as significant, not because the Alun opposition was unexpected, the informal channel through Miran had made their general position clear, but because of the manner in which they had expressed it. They had not attempted to maintain the appearance of alignment with the Vreth position. They had voted against it, openly, without explanation, which meant they had decided the political cost of continued association was higher than the political cost of public separation. That was a shift, the kind that does not reverse easily. The Karathi ambassador had said, in the formal session record, that the Council's credibility depended on its ability to distinguish between legitimate exercise of authority and misuse of institutional processes, and that the evidence recently entered into the diplomatic registry made that distinction available to any member species willing to read it carefully. The language was diplomatically measured. The meaning was not. He was saying, in the terms the Council used for such statements, that the Council had been used as a cover for something it should not have been used for, and that this was now publicly documented. The Humanath representative had said nothing during the formal session. Barrett noted this as itself significant. Their quiet public statements throughout the preceding weeks had been building a consistent record, and by this point, the record was sufficient that additional statements were not needed. Their silence was the silence of a case that had already been made. The enforcement motion failed. The session ended without any collective action directive against humanity. What it produced instead was a formal instruction to the Council's mediation office to initiate contact with the human diplomatic mission regarding a framework for resolution. A framework for resolution, the Council's bureaucratic language for, we need this situation to end, and we have concluded that achieving that requires engaging with the other party, as though they have interests worth accommodating. In 40,000 years of Council history, the reclassification mechanism had been used against smaller species 23 times. In all 23 cases, the species in question had eventually arrived at a negotiated settlement within the Council framework, on terms generally favorable to the Council's interests, and to whichever powerful faction had initiated the pressure. The framework had worked 23 times. This was the 24th time. I transmitted a message to Barrett. When the mediation office reaches out, receive them warmly. Tell them Ambassador Okonkwo is available to begin formal discussions as soon as the Council is prepared to engage on the substance, and do not indicate flexibility on any of the 4 requirements. He acknowledged. I transmitted a summary to Earth Command, noting that the second session had produced no enforcement directive, that the moderate bloc had grown to 21 species, and that formal mediation contact was anticipated within the week. Earth Command acknowledged within 3 hours. 3 hours for a summary report on a diplomatic development that did not require immediate operational response. That was faster than standard acknowledgement turnaround, and it told me that the people receiving my transmissions were paying close attention to every word. The resolution process took 11 weeks, which is fast by any historical standard for the Council. I know this because Barrett told me, and because Colin confirmed it from his knowledge of the historical record. 11 weeks for a formal resolution that required changing the Council's active record, allocating a new directorate seat, and producing a formal apology from the Vreth hegemony was, by every precedent available, remarkably fast. I mention this not to suggest that the 11 weeks felt fast. They did not. But because the pace itself was information about the degree to which the political dynamics had shifted. I spent those 11 weeks maintaining fleet presence in the Kepler Drift. I rotated positions between New Carthage, Port Avalon, Meridian, and the 3 border installations, which remained under UHF administrative authority until the formal resolution was signed. I held no dramatic confrontations and gave no significant speeches. I held position, maintained the record, kept my crew sharp, and trusted Barrett and Okonkwo to conduct the diplomatic work that the 11 weeks required. 3 weeks into the process, I visited Port Avalon in person. Lena had requested it, not for personal reasons, because she did not request things for personal reasons, but because the colonial administration had asked for a direct briefing from Fleet Command, and because a personal visit from the Fleet Admiral would communicate something that a remote briefing could not. She was right. She was always right about these things, which was one of the reasons I trusted her judgment as completely as I did. I flew a shuttle from the unconquered sun to Port Avalon's main orbital platform and then down through the atmosphere to the surface, and I spent 6 hours on the ground. I met with the Colonial Administration, with the Community Representatives Council, and with a public gathering that had been organized at the Commons, a large shared space in the center of Port Avalon's primary settlement, built by community labor over 15 years of weekends and days off, with some of the original construction notes still painted on one wall, left there deliberately because the people who built it had decided that showing the work mattered as much as showing the result. I told them directly, without softening, what had happened and why. I told them about the reclassification decree and the border installation operations and the evidence record and the status of the negotiations. I told them what was required of the council before we would consider this resolved. I told them it was going to be resolved on those terms. A woman in the front row of the Commons gathering, she was perhaps 50, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years working outdoors in Port Avalon's particular combination of sun and salt wind, asked me how sure I was. I told her I was completely sure, which was true, but I also told her that complete certainty about outcomes was different from complete certainty about timing, and that I could tell her when this was finished, but not exactly how many days it would take to finish. I told her that the situation had changed fundamentally, and that we were not going to accept anything less than full resolution of everything we had put on the table. She looked at me for a moment, with the look of someone who has heard reassuring things from people with authority before, and knows how to tell the difference between genuine confidence and performed calm. She was evaluating me in real time, and I let her, because I had no interest in persuading anyone of anything I did not believe completely. Then she said, "All right." 2 words. Not thank you. Not reassurance accepted. Not the language of someone seeking comfort. The language of someone who had listened, evaluated, and decided the assessment was credible, and was now going to hold the person who gave it to account, and was also going to get back to the work of her life, on the planet she had chosen to build it on. All right. I thought about those 2 words for the rest of the day, and on the shuttle back up, and on the transit back to the unconquered sun. I have thought about them many times since. There is a kind of trust that is not given, only earned, and the way you know you have earned it is that it does not feel like relief. It feels like a new weight added to everything you are already carrying, a weight you accept because you understand what it means. I carried it back to my chair, and I kept working. The VRETH negotiating team was as resistant as expected throughout the 11 weeks. The apology language was the most protracted element. Ambassador Okonkwo returned 22 drafts, each accompanied by a polite, specific note, explaining precisely what was wrong with the current language, and exactly what would be required for the next draft to be acceptable. Barrett described her in one of his reports as immovable in the way that very experienced diplomats with complete knowledge of their terrain are immovable, not because they are inflexible, but because they know exactly what they are asking for and why, and the reasons do not change with the number of drafts. Draft 7 had attempted to acknowledge harm in general, without specifying what the harm was. Returned. Draft 11 had used language that attributed the disruption to certain administrative actions taken during a complex period of territorial review. Returned. Draft 17 had been the longest attempt, running to 6 pages, which Okonkwo had returned with a 3-line note that said the length of a document is not the same as its specificity, and that a 6-page apology that avoids naming what it is apologizing for is less useful than a 1-paragraph apology that names it clearly. Draft 23 was the one that got signed. The Security Directorate seat had required a full council vote in the 10th week of negotiations. The vote was not unanimous. It passed with support from the Karathi, the Umanoth, 14 of the 21 species that had raised concerns, and 8 additional species whose support Barrett assessed as primarily economic in motivation, rather than principled. They had read the shifting landscape and concluded that accommodating humanity's institutional position was less costly to their interests than continued disruption of regional trade and political stability. 8 species whose support was calculated rather than principled was not the ideal coalition I might have wanted, but institutional change happens through the accumulation of votes, and a calculated vote is worth exactly as much in the final tally as a principled one. The seat was allocated, The nomination process began. I received the news of the vote's passage while on the bridge of the unconquered sun, holding position in the Port Avalon system as part of the rotating coverage. Francis Webb read me the result from the council's official relay, and I sat with it for a moment. A human would be in the room the next time someone tried to do to us what had been done to us. That was what it meant. Not just a protest, not just a diplomatic relationship, but an actual seat, an actual vote, an actual presence in the space where these decisions were made. We had been subject to decisions made without us for 30 years. That was over. I said nothing for a moment. Then I told Francis to log the vote in the operational record and to relay the news to the fleet. Then I went back to watching the sensor grid for the Port Avalon system, which was calm and empty of anything threatening, the way it was supposed to be. The 23rd draft of the apology language was accepted 3 days before the scheduled signing ceremony. Barrett transmitted it to me with a cover note that said, "This is what we needed." I read it 3 times. It named actions. It specified harm. It did not qualify, hedge, or soften in the ways that 22 previous drafts had attempted. It said, in the formal language of the Grand Conclave's permanent record, what had actually happened, and it attributed the responsibility for what had happened to the party responsible for it. Not a statement that something unfortunate had occurred during a complex period. A statement that specific actions had been deliberately taken, that those actions had caused specific harms to specific populations, and that the Vreth hegemony acknowledged its responsibility for those actions and for those harms. I thought, reading it, about the woman in the Port Avalon Commons who had said all right. I thought about what her all right had been responding to, and whether this document, read in the right order alongside everything else in the record, would let a person understand the full account of what had happened here, and why it had gone the way it had. It would. I was sure of it. The signing was in 3 days. I went to the observation lounge that evening and looked at the stars over Port Avalon and thought about everything it had taken to get here, and about what came next, which was the same as everything that always came next in this work. More decisions, more situations, more moments that required the specific kind of clarity I had been carrying since 0347 on the night the decree arrived. I thought about the wall of remembrance, about the faces and names it would carry going forward, about the decision that had been made in 2091, in those assembly halls and reconstruction zones, to build again and continue and refuse the alternative. About how every decision made since that decision had been, in some sense, the carrying forward of it. We kept moving. That was the fact of it. The stars over Port Avalon burned the way they always had. Cold and honest. We had always moved toward them on those terms. We still did. The signing ceremony was held in the formal reception hall of the Council's administrative complex on Elun Prime, a space designed, architecturally, to make everyone present feel the accumulated weight of 40,000 years of institutional history. High vaulted ceilings, walls inlaid with the seals of member species, lighting that was precise and faintly golden, the particular quality of light that says, "This room has seen things that mattered, and you are in it now." I was present in my dress uniform. I had retrieved it from storage 3 days earlier, and spent what was probably an unreasonable amount of time ensuring it was correctly pressed and arranged, because if I was going to be in this room on this day, I intended to look precisely like what I was, not a statement, just accuracy. Representatives from 23 member species were in the hall. The Vreth delegation sat in their assigned positions, with the controlled composure of professionals, trained to remain composed when composure requires significant effort. Ambassador Vel Sarath was among them. He had been at the center of this from the beginning, the formal request, the seconding, the closed session, the enforcement motion that had received 3 votes, and his presence at the signing was correct, in the way that most of what had occurred in this resolution process was correct. Not comfortable, but accurate. Ambassador Elise Okonkwo was across the room from me, speaking to the Karathi representative, relaxed in the specific way that people are relaxed when they have done the work they needed to do, and they know it. She was not performing anything. She had spent 11 weeks doing what needed doing, and had arrived at this day as herself, which was, in its own way, the most impressive thing she had done throughout the process. Owen Barrett was near the back of the hall, in the position of someone whose contribution had been essential, but whose role operated better from the edge than from the center. He caught my eye at one point across the room and gave me the small nod that says, "Yes, this is actually happening." And then he returned to his quiet observation. The ceremony proceeded with the formality the council applied to all formal proceedings. The document was read aloud in its entirety, each clause, each paragraph, each specific acknowledgement, by a council administrator before the relevant parties signed. This was the standard protocol for formal resolutions entered into the permanent record. It was slower than a summary reading would have been, and this slowness was deliberate, because the document entering the record was not a summary. It was the document itself, and the reading aloud of it was the record's way of making its content fully public in the most literal sense, heard, in this room, by 23 delegations, by the recording systems that would transmit the session to every council relay in the galaxy. The recognition of the 3 colonial worlds. Read, signed. The removal of Resolution 7741 Delta from the active record. Read, signed. The formal apology. The administrator read it slowly, clause by clause, the language that Okonkwo had returned 22 drafts to produce. The specific naming of actions, the acknowledgement of deliberate coordination, the specific harms named to specific populations, the formal statement of responsibility. Velsarath signed it without looking up from the document. Then Okonkwo signed it with the same steady hand she had used to compose the cover notes that had accompanied the 22 returned drafts. And I watched her sign, and I thought about every hour of those 11 weeks, and about the woman in the Port Avalon Commons who had looked at me and said, "All right." The security director at Annex. Read, signed. The ceremony ended. The document, with its seals and signatures, was transferred to the protective case that would hold it until it was formally archived in the Council's permanent record collection. A council administrator announced that the session was closed. The formal part of the day was over. The reception was the Council's standard format for post-ceremony gatherings. Food, drink, the gradual dissolution of the room's formal structure into the more complicated texture of a space full of species that needed to understand where they stood with each other, now that the document was not the center of everything. I moved through it with the awareness that my presence communicated something that I could not fully control, and did not fully try to. What I could control was how I conducted myself, and what I had decided, before entering the room, was to be exactly what I was, in exactly the measure I had always been it. I found the Karathi ambassador and thanked him without over-explaining, because he had not done what he had done for thanks and he did not need it elaborated. He said that the evidence record had been the determining factor for him, that the pattern analysis and the authenticated communication chains had made the position tenable within his own council, in a way it would not have been without them. I told him I was glad the record had been thorough. He said that thorough records were worth more in the long term than impressive statements, and I agreed with him, and we talked briefly about something else entirely, and then I moved on. I found the Humanath representative, Ceres, near the hall's wide observation ports, where the stars above Elun Prime were visible, in the planet's particular evening sky. They were among the shorter species by physical measure, and they had a stillness about them that reminded me, in some ways, of Colin Oren, the stillness of someone who was always actively processing, whose outward calm was evidence of engagement rather than its absence. "How does this day feel?" they asked. It was a genuine question. I had been asked variations of it several times in the past few months, and I had answered each one honestly, which meant some of the answers had surprised the people asking them. I gave Ceres the honest version. "Necessary," I said, "not joyful. I find it difficult to separate the outcome from everything that produced it, and what produced it had costs that do not go away because the outcome is good. You carry the process forward with you," they said. "Yes. Is that a burden?" I thought about Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe in the drive control room. I thought about Lena Harlow quietly becoming Commander Harlow on the bridge with her family on Port Avalon. I thought about Lieutenant Oates asking how you do command. "Sometimes," I said. "And sometimes it is what makes you move, when moving is what matters." Ceres considered this. "I have encountered your species many times in diplomatic contexts," they said. "I have read extensively about your history, and about the specific qualities that make you different from other council member species. I believed I understood the important things about humanity, but I find, in conversations like this one, that there is something I keep encountering that does not fit any of my existing frameworks." "What is it?" I said. "The combination," they said. You carry the cost of your victories as personally as you would carry the cost of your defeats. And yet, this does not slow you down or make you hesitate. It seems to be the same quality that makes you act. I held that for a moment. Yes, I said. I think that is accurate. It is genuinely different, they said. From everything else I have encountered in 40 years of council work, I do not have a framework for it. We grew up differently, I said. Not better. Just differently. In a way that happened to matter for the situation we have just come through. Velsarath and I occupied the same reception for the better part of 2 hours without speaking to each other, which was both expected and appropriate. At one point we were briefly on the same side of the room, I near the observation port, he near the document display, and our eyes met across perhaps 20 meters of space and 23 delegations. I did not look away. He held the gaze for 3 seconds, and then he returned to his conversation. 3 seconds was the entire exchange. It was sufficient. It said, without any language, I know what happened, and you know what happened, and the document in that case now says what happened, and we are both going to have to conduct ourselves in reference to that going forward. Ambassador Okonkwo found me near the end of the reception, as the hall was beginning to thin. She had conducted herself through 11 weeks of negotiations, with a precision and patience that I would have found remarkable if I had not been told to expect exactly that from her. She had returned 22 drafts. She had been unwavering on every requirement. She had arrived at this day without appearing to have spent any of herself on the process, which I knew was not true but which was itself a kind of professional accomplishment. 22 drafts, I said, when she reached me. She smiled slightly, not a broad smile, the smile of someone who finds a number faintly amusing in retrospect. 22, she confirmed. Was there a moment when you considered accepting something less specific? No, she said, simply, without elaboration, the way she said most things. Then she continued. The precision was the entire point. An apology that acknowledges harm in general, without naming it, is not an acknowledgement. It is a statement that something regrettable occurred, which is different. The record needed to say what actually happened, with the specificity that allows anyone reading it to understand what happened, or the record was not doing its job. And they knew that, I said. That is why they kept trying to soften it. Of course. A specific apology can be cited, verbatim, forever. A general one can be characterized and recharacterized as positions shift. The Vreth understood the difference. So did I. She looked across the hall toward the document display. That document is going to be cited by species that need to understand what occurred here, by species that are trying to understand what the Council is, and what it can and cannot legitimately do, by species, potentially not yet Council members, that are watching how the most powerful galactic institution handles the situation that results when it is misused by its own members. The precision of what is written will matter for all of those purposes. I thought about that. You are going to be very effective on the Security Directorate, I said. She gave me the look of someone being told something they have known for longer than the conversation has been going on. The nomination process is still open, she said. Yes, I said. I know. My orders had arrived 2 days before the signing. Fleet Marshal, the unconquered sun, to dry dock for repairs and refit, and when she came out, she would lead the first ship of a new class. I had named the class before leaving for Aelin Prime, because the naming needed to come from me, and because I had been thinking about the name for weeks. Reckoning. Not as a threat directed at anyone, not as a boast, as a description of what the past several months had been. A reckoning is the closing of accounts, the moment when the distance between what is and what ought to be is finally closed, when things are brought into alignment with the truth of them. That was what this had been. The name should say so, accurately, and without drama. Later that evening, I went to the observation deck of the diplomatic mission building, which had a clear view of Aelin Prime's night sky. The stars above Aelin Prime were the same stars they were everywhere, cold and honest, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them in the past several months. I looked at them for a long time. I thought about the decree that had arrived at 0347, in a different star system, in a different phase of this story. I thought about the 48-hour acknowledgement window I had never sent, because we had stopped operating inside their framework before the window opened. I thought about 47 ships converging on New Carthage, and Lena Harlow quietly squaring her shoulders on the bridge, and Colin Oren with his mismatched socks and his precise understanding of everything that was at stake. I thought about Lieutenant Oates asking how you do command. I thought about Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe. I thought about 300 million people living on worlds that were, as of this morning, formally and permanently and irrevocably theirs. The document in the case on the other side of the building said so. The vote in the council registry said so. The security directorate seat, waiting for its occupant, said so. The Galactic Council had made one error. They had looked at humanity and seen a species that could be pressured through institutional mechanisms into a position of accommodation, without asking the question that actually mattered. What had shaped this species? And what had that shaping produced? And was the framework they were about to apply appropriate to what they were applying it to? They had not asked. They had assumed. And the assumption was wrong in the specific way that assumptions are wrong when they are based on incomplete understanding. Not malicious, not irrational, just based on data that did not include the most important thing. The most important thing was the collapse of 2091, and what came out the other side of it, and what kind of civilization is built by people who have already been inside the end and come through it, and have decided, on the other side, that they are going to build. That was not in any briefing document. It was in the wall of remembrance, and in the community assemblies of the relief camps, and in the hands of every engineer and crew member and officer who had stood in the positions they had stood in over the past several months. The galaxy knew it now. The record showed it. The document in the case, and the vote in the archive, and the seat in the directorate all showed it, each in their own way. We were here. We had always been here, and we were staying. A message came through on my personal comm. Low priority flag, from the Alun diplomatic mission. It was from Mirren. She wrote that she had attended the signing ceremony, but had watched from a distance rather than claiming a position among the formal participants, because her role in what had led to this day had been informal, and she did not feel it appropriate to place herself within the formal frame of an event that had required formal work by formal parties. She said she was glad the outcome had been what it was, which was her personal assessment rather than a diplomatic one, and she knew the difference. And then she wrote something I read 3 times, standing in the evening air of an alien world's observation deck, with the stars overhead. She said that she had studied humanity for 6 years before this situation began. She had read the academic literature, conducted interviews, written analyses. She had considered herself, by any reasonable measure, well-informed. She had been wrong about the most important thing, not about the facts of humanity's history, not about the timeline or the statistics or the documented record, but about what those facts meant in practice. What it meant that a species had survived what humanity had survived, and had arrived at this point still entirely itself, still moving, still unwilling to accept the version of events that powerful interests had tried to impose. She asked whether I would be willing to occasionally answer questions from someone who wanted to genuinely begin their understanding over, from the start. I stood there on the observation deck and thought about what the right answer was. The right answer was simple. It was the simplest thing in the world. All we had ever wanted, from the beginning of all of this, was to be seen accurately, not managed from a distance, not categorized as something smaller and more containable than we were, not handed a framework that had been built for species with a different history, to be seen as what we were and treated accordingly. Someone asking to start their understanding over from the beginning was someone making the choice to look honestly. That was all we had ever wanted. I wrote back 2 words: start asking. I put the comm in my pocket. I looked at the stars for a while longer, the same stars as everywhere, burning with the same cold honesty they had been burning with before any of this began, and would continue to burn with long after the last record of it was archived. I had always found that easier to sit with than most alternatives. Not because cold indifference was comforting, because honesty was. Even cold honesty. Even the honesty that does not care about you at all. The truth was always better than the other thing. I went back inside. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do, and we would always do it, and the stars would burn the way they always had, and we would keep moving under them. That was enough. That had always been enough. I became Fleet Marshal on a Tuesday, which felt like the wrong day for something that significant, and I said so to Lena Harlow, who told me without sympathy that significant things do not wait for better days, and that I should probably put the uniform on. She was right, as she was usually right about the things that mattered. So I put the uniform on, and I stood in the ceremony, and I received the promotion from the Secretary of War, who was present in person, which I had not expected. Martin Cole had flown to the Unconquered Sun's dry dock facility at Kepler Station, without announcement and without a formal delegation, which was characteristic of him. He arrived the way a person arrives when they are there because they have decided they want to be there, not because the occasion requires it. He stood in the maintenance bay of a ship being actively repaired, surrounded by scaffolding and equipment and the sounds of work being done, and he handed me the Fleet Marshal's insignia with the same measured gravity he brought to everything. The maintenance bay was not the formal setting that a promotion ceremony was supposed to have. It was accurate, which was better. After the formal part was done, we stood together near a viewport that showed the Unconquered Sun's hull from outside, the repair crews visible in their environment suits, working on the ventral section where the fracture had run after the Meridian transit. The new hull plating was going in slowly and precisely, the way things go in when they need to last. I read every report you filed, Cole said. I filed thoroughly, I said. Yes. Was that deliberate? The precision of the documentation. Everything we did needed to be defensible to anyone who read it, I said. 100 years from now, I wanted whoever looked at those records to understand exactly what was done, and exactly why, without needing to interpret anything or fill in gaps. I wanted the record to be self-explanatory. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the repair work through the viewport. You were already thinking about the historical record while you were conducting the operations, he said. The historical record is what we leave behind, I said. It is the only version of what we did that persists indefinitely. If that version is accurate, everything we did continues to mean what it meant. If it is not accurate, the meaning gets lost. I wanted it to be accurate. He looked at me for a moment, with the gray eyes and the measured expression, and then he said, "The Reckoning class. You chose the name." Yes. The council had no comment on it. The council has recently learned to be thoughtful about the comments it offers on human decisions. Something moved at the corner of his expression, too small to be a smile, in that direction. He left later that afternoon, back to the work of running a civilization from the inside, which is harder in its way than running it from a fleet command, and I had always respected that, even when the decisions coming from that level were difficult to receive. The dry dock period lasted 8 weeks. The Unconquered Sun came out of it different, in the way that things repaired rather than replaced are different. She still had the same essential structure, the same bones, but the bones had been reinforced to account for what she had actually been through, and the new plating along the port ventral section was a fraction stronger than the original had been, because Kiran Patel had overseen the specification, and Patel always built in what had been learned, rather than simply restoring what had existed before. The ship was better for having been broken and fixed than she would have been if she had never been pushed to the point of breaking. I thought about that during the first transit after the refit. I thought about it more than once. Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe were both assigned to the dry dock facility during the refit period. I had requested this specifically, through channels that made it clear the request was a personal one, because I believed they had earned the right to see the work completed on the ship they had helped bring home. They were junior engineers, Claire 24, Daniel 26, and they had done something that had made the Meridian operation possible, and they had done it because they chose to, clearly, when the choice was in front of them. I spoke to them one afternoon in the maintenance bay, during a break between shifts. I found them eating lunch near a viewport with a view of the outer hull work, and I sat near them without announcement, and I told them what I had told no one else, that I had been holding their names since the moment Patel told me they had volunteered, and that I had held them for every minute of the transit. Claire looked at me steadily. "From before we even went in?" "From the moment I knew you were going to," I said. Daniel was quieter. He had the slightly stunned quality of someone who had done something significant and was still in the process of fully understanding that they had done it. He looked at his lunch for a moment. "We just did what was needed," he said. "Anyone would have." "No," I said. "Most people in your position, given the same information and the same moment of choice, would have been willing to do it. That is different from 2 specific people in that control room at that specific time, choosing yes when it was their turn to choose. The fact that others might have done it does not mean that you doing it was not the specific, real thing that mattered. He looked up. Did we make a difference? He said. If we had arrived at the standard transit time, after the Vreth deadline, what would have happened? It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer, rather than a comfortable one. I believe the Vreth commander would not have acted against the station, I said. His calculation required compliance, not confrontation, and confronting 60,000 civilians without a clear military advantage was not in his operational interest. But I cannot tell you with certainty what would have happened in a timeline that did not occur, because what occurred is that you were in the drive control room for 7.5 hours, and we arrived when we arrived, and 60,000 people went to bed that night in their own spaces. The fact that we cannot test the alternative does not reduce the significance of what you chose to do in the timeline that is real. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Those words again. I had heard them from the woman in the Port Avalon Commons, and I had carried them since, and now I heard them from Daniel Lowe in a maintenance bay on a dry dock station, and they meant the same thing in both places. The acknowledgement of someone who has listened, evaluated, and decided to receive what has been said and carry it forward, not seeking comfort, not performing acceptance, actually receiving the weight and deciding to hold it. I left them to finish their lunch. I walked back through the dry dock facility and looked at the hull of the unconquered sun from the inside, the new plating along the port ventral section, the reinforced framework visible through the open maintenance panels where work was still in progress. I stood there for a long time. She was going to be different when she came out, better in the ways that mattered. The same was true of a great deal else. The first ship of the Reckoning class launched from New Carthage Orbital Shipyard 7 months after the signing ceremony, and I was there for the launch. New Carthage was the right place for it. It was the first colony we had secured, the world where Veth Saran's formation had made its calculation at 29 minutes and 47 seconds and decided to leave. It was where the first thing had happened, and it was right that the first ship of a new class launched from there rather than from anywhere else. I was in the observation gallery of the New Carthage orbital platform when the ship came out of its construction bay under its own power for the first time. I watched it through the viewport, larger than the unconquered sun, built on everything that had been learned in the past year, faster and better shielded, and more capable in the specific ways that had turned out to matter when it mattered. The station's public address system broadcast the launch. On the planet below, 80 million people could see the ship's running lights against the dark if they looked up at the right moment. I do not know how many of them did. I do not know how many understood what they were seeing if they did. I thought about what the ship represented. Not a threat, that was not the language it had been named in. A reckoning. The closing of accounts. The moment when the distance between what is and what ought to be is finally closed. That had happened, and the ship carried the name of it, and it would carry that name into whatever came next. Whatever came next was going to require the same things that had gotten us here. Clarity about what was real. Willingness to act on that clarity. The specific kind of resolve that does not look like anger, because it is not anger. It is something colder, and more specific, and more durable than anger. The resolve of people who have already been through the worst, and have come to a very clear understanding of what they will and will not accept. Those qualities were not going anywhere. They were in the ship's name. They were in the crew's training. They were in the doctrine that had been written and revised and refined over the past 12 months, as everything that had been learned in the Kepler drift was worked into the fleet's understanding of itself. They were, most importantly, in the people. I received a message on my personal comm as I was watching the launch. It was from Lena Harlow, who was on Port Avalon that day. She had taken personal leave, the first time she had done so in 8 months, and I had approved it with specific relief, because Lena Harlow was someone who needed to be reminded occasionally that she was allowed to not be Commander Harlow for a while. The message was a photograph, her sister and brother-in-law and their 2 children, standing in front of what I recognized as the commons area of Port Avalon's primary settlement. The children were squinting into the camera in the way children always do when asked to hold still, and her sister was laughing at something happening just outside the frame. Lena had written a single line beneath the photograph. "All right. I kept that photograph. I have it still." Mirren had been sending questions for 8 months, with the regularity and seriousness of someone genuinely engaged in understanding, rather than in the performance of inquiry. Her questions had started broad. What was the collapse era like? Not historically, but as lived experience carried through generations, and had become increasingly specific, because that is the direction genuine understanding moves, from general frameworks down to the particular details that actually constitute a thing. Her final message before the Reckoning class launch was the one I found most interesting. She asked, "When you look back at what happened in the Kepler drift, what lesson do you want humanity to carry forward? Not the lesson for the Council, not the lesson for other species, but the one for us." I thought about it for 2 days before answering. The easy answer was something about strength, or resolve, or the consequences of underestimating a species that had survived what we had survived. Those answers were true, and they were also partial, and partial truths in answer to serious questions are a form of evasion. The real answer was harder to state, and I sat with it for 2 days until I felt like I had it right. Here is what I sent to Mirren. The lesson I want us to carry is not that we are capable of responding forcefully when we are threatened. That is already known, and knowing it is not the important thing. The lesson is about the nature of the patience we extended and the nature of the decision to stop extending it. We were patient with the Council for 30 years. That patience was genuine. We believed in the framework. We thought its mechanisms, imperfect as they were better than the alternatives, and we functioned within it in good faith, filing complaints through proper channels, and attending sessions and paying our dues, and extending the benefit of the doubt. The decision to stop was equally genuine. It was not impatience. It was not anger. It was the recognition that the framework had been used to do something it should never have been used to do, and that continuing to extend the benefit of the doubt to an institution that had misused it would not make the institution better. It would simply make the misuse easier. Both of those things, the 30 years of genuine patience and the clear decision to end it, are part of who we are. The lesson is not to be less patient. The lesson is to understand the difference between patience as virtue and patience as the pretense that a harm is not occurring. We were patient until the harm was undeniable, and the patience had become a kind of complicity. Then we stopped. That distinction is what I want us to carry. Not the moment of action, but the understanding of when action was the right response, and why. Because the next situation will be different, and the one after that, and the lesson needs to be portable, rather than specific to these events. I sent that to Mirren. She wrote back within a day. She said, "That is the most precise description of the thing I was failing to understand that I have ever received from anyone about anything. Thank you." "You are welcome," I wrote. "Keep asking." The Reckoning was clear of the construction bay now, running on its own power, its lights visible against the dark as it moved toward the open space of the system. Below, New Carthage turned in its orbit, 80 million lives going about their ordinary morning, some of them watching the lights of the new ship against the black, some of them not. The planet was as it had always been, working, building, ordinary in the best sense of the word. I watched the ship until it was far enough out that its individual running lights were no longer distinguishable from the stars around it, and then I watched the stars. The Galactic Council had made one error. It had looked at humanity and seen a species that could be pressured, reclassified, and managed back into accommodation through mechanisms that had worked against every other species they had been applied to, without asking the question that would have told them everything. What had made us what we were, and what did that mean for what we would do when the mechanisms were turned against us? They had not asked. The answer would have changed everything if they had. The answer was the collapse, and the assembly halls, and the decision made by people who had no particular reason to believe it was going to work, but who made it anyway, because the alternative was not something they were willing to choose. The answer was the wall of remembrance, and every name on it, and every face. The answer was 30 years of patient membership in a framework we believed in, followed by 11 weeks of resolute action when the framework was misused, followed by 11 weeks of careful negotiation that produced a document precise enough to be cited by any species that wanted to understand what had happened and what it meant. The answer was Claire Ashworth and Daniel Lowe in the drive control room. The answer was Lena Harlow becoming Commander Harlow on the bridge. The answer was the woman in the Port Avalon Commons saying "all right," and meaning it the way she meant it. The galaxy knew us now, in a way it had not known us before. Not the version of us that had been read from 30 years of patient membership. The real version, what we were, fully, including the part that moved when moving was necessary, and held the line when holding was necessary, and carried its costs as weight, rather than setting them aside. We were still moving. We had always been moving. The stars outside the observation viewport were the same stars they had always been, cold and honest, and completely indifferent to everything humanity had done beneath them, everything the Council had decided and disputed and resolved, everything the past year had required and produced. I had always found that easier to sit with than most alternatives. Not because indifference was comforting, because honesty was. Even when the honesty was cold and distant and did not care about you at all, it was better than the other thing, the soft lie of a galaxy that pretended to be more interested in your welfare than it was. The stars burned the way they always had. I sat in my chair on the observation deck of New Carthage Orbital Platform, Fleet Marshal of the United Human Fleet, watching a ship named Reckoning carry itself out into the dark, and I thought, yes, this is what we do. This is what we have always done. And we are not finished.